NITV wishes to advise that this program may contain images of people who have passed.
Hello and welcome to this Point Special. I'm John Paul Janke. Hailing from the riverina town of Junee, Katrina Fanning is a woman with a strong understanding of country and of governance. Living and working in the ACT for over 25 years, she's held senior executive roles in government bodies from Centrelink to the Department of Education. Now she's the chairperson of the ACT Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elected body. In this interview with Katrina, we speak about how government reform can develop and strengthen close the gap structures so that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can be more involved in and lead the decision-making process. Well, thanks for joining us, Katrina. It's great to have you on the show. Now, through the 80s and 90s, Indigenous self-determination was at the forefront with a lot of our organisations, some of which you worked at, Department of Aboriginal Affairs, ADC, AHL, ATSIC, and the TSRA up in the Torres Strait. So self-determination was at the forefront. Even ATSIC had its big regional council network, 35 regional council, hundreds of regional councils, but it was abolished. Do you think we've gone backwards in terms of self-determination?
I think at a community governance connection service provision level, no. I think there are still lots of areas where our people are taking on the challenges that face us and trying to do something about it, and doing it in a way that brings their communities together. But the structures and systems that we need to interact with at the local, state and national level have taken away the opportunities for self-determination to thrive and for those voices to be heard. And that certainly is something that needs to be redressed if we're to make the progress we need for our communities.
And are you concerned that that's taken almost 16 years to actually come to sort of maybe a line in the sand and say what we did 16 years ago in abolishing those structures or those connections was wrong?
Absolutely. I think it certainly wasn't a decision that was driven by the people who self-determination was about. It was done for other purposes. And certainly one of the issues with those structures was that the self-determination components weren't consistent across all tiers of government, and that was part of the problem to it, that they hadn't actually built in self-determination at every level of delivery and decision making, and only picked out a couple of places where that was possible to happen. And that's what made it really vulnerable to one or two decisions for it to be completely gone. It needs to be far more systemic in the way decisions are made about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, rather than in one or two spots that are easy to remove.
And at the moment we're having lots of conversations about Black Lives Matter, and a lot of people are referencing back to the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody and the recommendations that were or weren't implemented from that Royal Commission. And the Royal Commission put the right of self-determination at the very forefront of its report. And it basically argued that Aboriginal people needed to be consulted as a matter of urgency on law and policy decisions about their lives. And in fact, the report really put it quite bluntly, and it said, it is beyond policy and bureaucrats to solve this problem. Do you think the failures that we're seeing now, not only in incarceration rates, but in a range of some of those close the gap targets, is the result of a lack of proper consultation?
It absolutely is, and one of the fundamental problems with it is that governments have confused consulting and advisory type of roles with true self-determination, with the power that comes to be able to make decisions and be accountable for those decisions, has never truly been placed solely in our hands for our own purposes. And so each of the other approaches that have been tried have been some way to self-determination, but not complete models that we can hold ourselves accountable to against. There's always been someone just watching over our shoulder, double checking if we're doing the right thing. So it's not, we've not realised the potential of self-determination in a complete sense in any of the sectors that we need to.
Okay, now looking to today, you're the chairperson of the ACT Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elected body, and that relationship with the Territory Government is unique. And they're the only government that really has invested in an elected structure.
Absolutely.
For Indigenous peoples within its boundaries. What can other state and territory governments learn from this model?
Well, firstly, it dispels a bit of the myth that having a direct voice to government fractures the chambers of Parliament, fundamentally shifts the way government has always run. What it does show, it's a system change that allows a direct voice of our communities to hold people who are making decisions about our lives accountable for those decisions. That it's not enough to just be busy, you need to have impact. It's not enough to have a good idea, it has to be one that's inclusive of us. And the processes that we have in place of reports needing to be publicly tabled, of being able to sit in front of the people who run these departments, the highest level of decision making, and ask them directly the questions that our community want answered, is a really powerful thing that helps to set their agenda as well, to give them guidance on what we want and for us to be accountable on the things that we're asking for.
Is it fair to say that at the very start and coming forward to today, that it was a learning curve for both sides of that partnership, for the Aboriginal community here in the ACT, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community here in the ACT, but also the ACT government?
Absolutely. Each term it matures, both on how our community approaches and engages with it, and how the government has been able to reframe how it works with our communities. It's not perfect, but it certainly is something that together we work hard at the table. We stay at the table. We certainly don't agree all the times that we're at the table, but it provides that opportunity to test each other on the ideas that we have and to hold each other accountable, not just on being busy, not just on being able to do the symbols, but to fundamentally see what's different in our people's lives and in the aspirations they have. And in a jurisdiction like the ACT, if we can't get that sort of structure right, there's probably it's because we're not trying hard enough, because it's absolutely possible here.
So your partnership with the ACT government is underpinned by the ACT Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Agreement, which started last year but stretches towards 2028. How does that keep the ACT government accountable?
So there's a couple of things that are important with that as well. So we do the sort of traditional consultations, but we went back to things like the Deaths in Custody report, the Stolen Generations report, and a range of really significant consultations that have happened for our community here to repeat that actually our community's been asking for some very consistent things for decades now, to give it a greater emphasis. What we've then done with the agreement is to set some really tangible aspirations, to use a strength-based approach to the agreement of where do we want to be in 10 years, not what do we want to get rid of in 10 years. And then each term of the elected body, which is about a 3-year term, the people that our community elects to represent us gets to set the implementation plan for that 3-year period. So we assess how far and how well we're doing. We then put to government, okay, we're doing well in these, or we want more of this, and so it's a living document, it's a living agreement that goes with the trends and the aspirations of our community. So it's not wholly cemented in on the activity. It gives us a chance to learn and to grow together, and potentially our aspiration is for there to be even more service organisations delivering to our community here, because the ones we have are excellent, do a great job, but there's a heavy burden and layer of responsibility on just too few organisations.
And how does that agreement help keep us accountable, us at the table?
And that's a really important factor. It's not enough to meet self-determination to just be raising issues, but what it does is it's got government to the table and agreement in letting us run some of these services, prioritising our organisations to do that, but it means we've got to show that we can, and we've got to start being able to demonstrate the impact of that. So far in the current agreement we're able to do that, and that it also gives every member of our community an opportunity to assess how well we're doing, and of course at election time they get to vote on how well they think we've done.
So the feedback's there, isn't it?
That's right.
So how can the ACT structure influence what you bring to the table in the federal government sort of space?
Yeah, so it's been great to be able to take the learnings of our own estimate style hearings, our reporting processes, our direct relationship with the heads of departments, to say this is possible. We work on solutions, we're very consistent in what we're asking for, there is processes to have these difficult discussions. As we come together as a coalition of a large number of Indigenous organisations who have a common theme of we represent groups because they've elected us to do so, gives us that opportunity to have that same sort of conversation at the national level about what the system needs to do to change, and that decisions that are made about the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have to have us involved in them. Not just to provide some advice that can be taken or left, but to actually use the knowledge that we have on things that work and build on those as well. So not just the deficit stuff, but there's plenty of strengths in our community organisations, things that they've learnt, including that more holistic approach to someone's issues, rather than I can only talk to you about your sore thumb, it doesn't matter that your leg's hanging off. You know, so there's a way. What it is bringing to the table is not just a focus on targets and numbers at the end of the line, but changing the way these relationships work, changing the way the rules are set, if you like, so that they are far more practical and relevant to communities in all parts of our country. So giving an opportunity for more local voices to have a direct line of sight to the decisions that are made and to feel included in that process.
Now, of course, with the Close the Gap targets, the catchphrase co-design is being attached now to a lot of those targets. What does co-design look like to you?
So co-design is being able to get at the table all of the elements that it's going to take to get this across the line. We need to understand why governments can or can't do certain things. And the beauty of us being at the table is some of the things that they just can't do, aren't able to do, we can. And so the idea is to play to each other's strengths about what it is that you're responsible for and we're responsible for, and ultimately the impact that combined we want to have. That means that we don't always, we have some ideas and it can't, and on targets, for example, and they might not get to the same level of ambition that we have, but it's about understanding why and the levers that we all have to make progress and to have an impact in people's lives. So I would say potentially what we're doing at the moment is more like a direct negotiation between equal partners, at least equal in decision making, not necessarily in the resources that we have attached to us, rather than a design. A co-design still suggests that you and I might come up with an idea and we have to send it off to someone else to get marked. That's not what's happening with the Coalition of the Peaks and this new Closing the Gap agreement. We've done consultations and helped get design ideas from our communities. Governments have done the same within their structures, but now we're actually at joint decision-making opportunities, and that's a lot different.
Mm. And do you think the COVID-19 pandemic and its ability maybe to get state and federal governments to work together for a common solution or a common purpose that they sometimes thought was actually unworkable and unachievable? Do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic now makes them wake up and say, actually, the things that we've said about the unachievable targets because they were state government responsibilities or they were federal government responsibilities and we couldn't meet those, we might be able to actually make some gains there?
Look, and COAG being dead and the new council that they're talking about, which is how this National Cabinet's been operating through COVID, certainly has seemed to have broken the roadblock that COAG was as more of theatre than actually making a difference in the lives of all Australians. So certainly the changes that have come about through COVID-19 are aimed at addressing that very specific issue that seemed to halt the progress that COAG may have been able to achieve. One of the important parts of that is that the changes to COAG and moving to this National Cabinet, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander issues is one of two areas that have automatically been signalled as going with that. So we're not lost in in where does this now sit with government decision making. It's been given a very clear priority that the work that's happening around Closing the Gap, the work that Joint Council and then underneath that Coalition of Peaks has been doing will be progressed and prioritised. And the opportunity that provides to us is much quicker and direct access to First Ministers, to the ultimate decision makers from a government perspective, so that we can cut through the layers of bureaucracy that we've had to navigate for so many years and sit at the table and be able to raise issues and make decisions at the same time, not come back in a few months and see what people might have thought about and what they decided.
All right, well, let's talk about some of the close the gap targets, but more generic. For a lot of people at home, they're not aware of the machinations between the peak bodies and the various layers of government. And in fact, earlier this year, at the normal close the gap sort of speeches and the reporting on the target, the 47 peak bodies were very critical of the close the gap targets. And in fact, you all came together and said that it was seemingly an endless cycle of failure.
Nearly 4,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have now had their say on what is needed to close the gap. Today, the Coalition of Peaks bring those voices to the Cabinet table.
What's changed between February and now?
So February, of course, is reporting on the old closing the gap arrangements. So we've been doing some work for about 18 months on this and done took where government was up to with its refresh, got them to put a hold on that and to trust us to go out to community and ask them, are these areas still what you want to focus on? So targets on their own won't drive the change that we need. We've certainly been able to extend the areas that these targets will focus on and to be able to pick up on a much broader range of issues, and whilst they're still in negotiations, areas of justice and family violence and our kids in out-of-home care are all things that are being considered to help measure that target, that impact. But the fundamental difference that I believe that we've been able to negotiate through this process are what we're calling priority reform areas, and these are the things that change the system, that change the relationship, that change the power dynamic in decision making. That's about no more consultation that says you're talking to Aboriginal people without us deciding who you speak to. And so providing structures at local, regional, state, national levels where we get to choose who represents our voice in those things. That's one of those areas. There's priority areas around our community-controlled organisations and the ability for Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people to run the services and provide the those elements for ourselves where that's possible. That mainstream service provision has to be better. It has to be more accessible, more understanding, more appropriate for our needs, because we've been citizens for a long time, and we need better data.
So it's about structural change, isn't it?
Absolutely. Because if you keep doing the same thing, expecting a different result.
All right. So let's talk about there's 47 peak bodies in the coalition. You and I have worked in Aboriginal affairs a long time. We know that 47 Aboriginal people don't have different views, have different priorities. Organisations are exactly the same. How do you manage those maybe differing priorities and differing opinions on where we should go?
Look, there's no doubt that this approach is pretty historic. Just from an Indigenous affairs, us working together, large organisations that have quite specialist expertise, but we all recognise that each other's areas impact us as well. We've put in a lot of extra effort, spent a lot of time, and even before COVID-19, given that we come from all over the country, a lot of phone hookups and those sort of things, focusing on the difference we want for life outcomes for our people, working from the things that we have in common. Each organisation still has the opportunity to be advocating and progressing their own individuals' organisations' needs with government and with communities. But really the coalition is about that common purpose of setting the systems and the relationships, the partnerships, standards, if you like, that all organisations will benefit from, whether they are a peak organisation with a large membership base or emerging new organisations. We're trying to reset how these things are done, and that each of those organisations can then choose what and when they do those things.
If the peak bodies are mostly funded by the federal government, how can you be critical of the federal government without expecting maybe some ramifications? So if you look at the ATSIC model, ATSIC was very critical of government over a long time, and in the end it was abolished by the federal government. So are you worried that if targets aren't met and the coalition becomes more critical of government, then your ability to advocate might be wound down through funding?
Look, certainly I think as each member organisation has had to work through those issues, but the collective nature of how we've done that offers some protection as well. It's not one group whose whole life will depend on what they do or don't say to government. This becomes a collective view, a collective voice of community, and I think that gives that a layer of protection. But one of the other important parts is with equal decision making also comes this equity and accountability. You know, both for us, back to our memberships, back to our communities, and as you'd know, our organisations are so used to having a higher threshold of accountability. It's not really something that we're scared of, and we're really confident that actually the Closing the Gap initiatives, the responsibility of governments, can't be fully delivered and their aspirations fully met without us.
What's the change you're wanting to see, or what are you hoping to actually see from the various peak bodies advising government in terms of those Close the Gap targets and the Aboriginal-led solutions that are affecting our people? So what do you want to see, or what are you hoping to see?
I want to see not just in specific purpose areas, but in the way that any of our people accessing any service are able to see that their needs can be met. Now, whether that's through a community-controlled organisation, which ours across all sectors have really great reputations, or if it's just walking into the Canberra Hospital today, that our community don't stop accessing services because they're worried if they're going to get a decent service or not. That regardless of which front door people walk through, they can expect that same standard of respect and being valued, that they are able to get the services they need when they need them, and that we can live not just as long as everyone else, but have the same quality of life in those years as well.
One more final question. You've raised a few issues there. What's your message to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and people, some of who may be withdrawn from the peak bodies and organisations as part of this coalition? What's your message to them?
So some might be withdrawn, some never participated in these processes, some have, and the trust either within our own way we work or with governments has been damaged some time in those decades that we talk about. But that what we are working towards provides an opportunity to be involved in whatever level and whichever way you're interested in and impacts you. Whether it's within a single issue in a single location, the work we're doing should open doors and opportunities for you, right through to, I know there's people in communities right now who are smart, know how to have great ideas. We're building a pathway to make sure that you can have as loud a voice and impact as you want to have in a way that works for our communities and keeps the level of improvement happening in the way that they want. So this isn't meant to be there's one council of 12 people and that's the only voice we have. This is about growing the opportunity for everybody's voice to be heard on the platform they want to stand on.
All right, Katrina, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, JP.
And that was Katrina Fanning, Chairperson of the ACT Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elected body. And if you would like to know more about the work the Coalition of Peaks are advocating for, visit their website at coalitionofpeaks.org.au and keep up to date with the latest news on Closing the Gap on our website. On behalf of the team, thanks for joining us. I'm John Paul Janke. See you next time.